And back in those days, there wasn't a lot known about the causes of Alzheimer's disease, but we knew that there were certain risk associations and that toxins like pesticides and mercuries could definitely raise your risk.
Welcome to the My Future Business Show, where we get you in front of your best audience and keep you there. Not only are we interviewing the biggest names in business to help you become even more successful, we're inviting you to book your spot on the show to help you grow your business. So at the end of the call, make sure you fill in the interview application form at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. Everybody who's on the line today, I'm just checking the settings because this is actually a live stream today. So again, welcome to Ralph and welcome to everybody who is on the live stream with us right now. I can confirm that we are live on the My Future Business Facebook page, and on today's topic, we're going to be looking at Alzheimer's and dementia, and we're going to deep dive into what they mean for you, and we're going to be exploring Ralph's new book, which he can talk about in a little bit more detail shortly. But before we do that, Ralph, I'd love to learn a little bit about yourself and how it came to be that you're doing what you're doing today.
Well, it's been a long journey, Rick. It started in the 90s when I decided to go back to school. And I went to acupuncture school, got my credentials, got licensed by the state, and started an integrative medicine practice. A few years later, while doing my research and trying to figure out my own problems, I realized that I had certain risk factors associated with neurological problems as you age. Mm-hmm. I had had a severe concussion in an auto accident when I was a young man, and I had been in the landscaping business prior to my immersion in the acupuncture and the field of health and wellness. So I realized that that work in the landscaping field had exposed me quite severely to pesticides. Oh. And also the pesticides were laden with mercury. And in doing my research and trying to figure out my problems, I started to put two and two together. And back in those days, there wasn't a lot known about the causes of Alzheimer's disease. But we knew that there were certain risk associations and that toxins like pesticides and mercuries could definitely raise your risk. Mm-hmm. So I started to delve into the research around all of that, came across a bit of information about the genetic predisposition portion of it all. Mm-hmm. And that really captured my imagination because I didn't know much about it and came to realize that this particular genetic risk marker is called A, P as in Paul, O, E4, was also a well-known and validated risk marker for cardiovascular disease. And I thought, wow, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, ApoE4, there's a lot here to look into. Mm-hmm. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinated I was. And I knew prior to all of this, Rick, that there was a book or more in me. And once I started to come across all this research and had this personal connection to it, I said, this is it. This is what I'm going to devote my life to in terms of the research and writing and getting some books out, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I thank you so much again for sparing us some time with us on the show, because I know this is something that potentially has the ability to impact each and every one of us as we age, and that's really what the focus of today's live stream is going to be about, is to look at some of the things that we can do actively, proactively to, I guess, be aware of those markers. But I think if we start from the fundamentals and go back a few steps here, Ralph, and maybe if you could share the differences between dementia and Alzheimer's, because I think sometimes they get used interchangeably, don't they?
Yes, they do, and they're not really interchangeable terms. Alzheimer's disease is a disease process that's marked by several types of lesions that build up in the brain as you age and with the disease process. And all of that can lead to dementia. But there are other forms of disease processes and neurological diseases that also lead to dementia, like Parkinson's disease. And the second leading cause of dementia is actually what's termed as vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, or cerebrovascular disease, when you're having an impaired blood flow to the brain, and atherosclerosis related to cardiovascular disease. And all of that morphs into a vascular dementia as you age. It's a very, very common thing, the second leading cause of a dementia after Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I sit here and I think to myself, you mentioned mercury before, and the first thing that came to my mind is fillings. Are we talking
Yeah.
about those types of things? And if you are, we are certainly most definitely all at risk somewhere along the lines. And it it's we can joke about it, but it's quite serious, isn't it?
Well, it can be.
Mm.
And let me be clear that when I started to look at the research, a lot of people were, and this was back around the year 1999, 1998, a lot of people were blaming metals, and pesticides as being causative for Alzheimer's disease.
Hmm.
And they're not necessarily causative, but they are huge risk factors. So in people that are genetically predisposed, all of these risk factors come into play in the aging process and definitely up your risk. Now, as far as mercury, I mentioned that marker, ApoE4.
Hmm.
And people that are carriers of that genetic risk variant actually do not do a very good job of clearing mercury out of their brain. And that's actually one of the jobs of that gene and that protein, is to help clear mercury out of the brain. So if you are an ApoE4 carrier and you do have dental amalgams, then that may be a more serious problem for you than the other person, because the body, tries to get rid of all of these toxins,
Yeah.
and some people do it much better than others. And the people that don't do it so well are the people that are more at risk. Those people need to be working with astute professionals that really understand this, that can put them through detoxification protocols. When I realized all this, I only had 2 or 3 amalgams at the time, but I got rid of them, and I did some pretty intense mercury detoxification because I had proven that I had what's called a body burden. And body burdens are just toxins that build up from metals and one thing or another.
Yeah.
But I had realized, because of the pesticide exposures, that I had built up a body burden. And I did what's called a mercury chelation test. And sure enough, my mercuries were sky high. So some people need to be evaluated for these things, along with many other risk factors that play into the higher risk for a neurological problem as you age. It's not just Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, it's funny, because we learn and as we become educated through time as a society, as a global society about these things, and it's a wonderful field that you're in, and anybody who is in this field can certainly contribute to, lesser people, if you like myself, who don't know actively what to do about these things. And I also think about, you talked about the pesticides and genetically modified foods, and just the amount of different angles that you need to consider. I guess one of the things that we're trying to do is to deliver value for the My Future Business audience. And I look at it from a practical standpoint. We've talked about the mercury testing, the load of your body. What are some of the other practical steps and things that people like you and I can do to improve our, avoidance of this?
Absolutely. So that's actually what I emphasize in the book, The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease.
Yes.
Because when I started to delve into the research, and again, back in 1999, the year 2000, there wasn't really a lot understood about how one could actually reduce the risk and hopefully prevent something like Alzheimer's disease. And let me just be clear that there are two forms of Alzheimer's disease that people should be aware of. One is early onset Alzheimer's disease, which you will, if you have the genes, because it's pretty much genetically determined disorder, you will contract this disease process and develop a dementia before the age of 60. But late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is what most people are at risk for as they age, is not genetically determined. Genes are only a portion of the risk association with late onset Alzheimer's disease. And that's what I talk about in the book. And the most important thing, believe it or not, to be aware of as you age in your risk association for Alzheimer's disease, particularly if you're an ApoE4 carrier, is cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
They're interrelated, aren't they?
Absolutely. And the research is so clear. So I make that point very strongly in the book, that looking at your risk or the disease process that brews silently for many years in either diabetes or cardiovascular disease, that really starts to set you up. There's lots of complications like obesity and hypertension and inflammation, which really affects the brain. And you need to take control. And the research is very clear that Alzheimer's disease has a 20 to 30-year time window at least,
Wow.
right?
Yep.
Before you're diagnosed or have a dementia. And so taking control of these risk factors in your 40s and 50s is so necessary. The research is now saying that midlife is actually a very critical stage in people's lives that are at risk for Alzheimer's, that they really need to be into an early assessment and prevention model, in midlife. Otherwise, they could be in big trouble in their 60s and 70s if they're not proactive like that.
So is this a matter of going to, if you wanted to be proactive right now, say you're in your 40s and you wanted to go and find out, based on this call, what do you do? Do you approach a local GP? How do you go about starting the process?
I wouldn't recommend a general practitioner because there may be some that are keeping up to date with the research. Perhaps they have an interest themselves in Alzheimer's and helping their patients.
Mm-hmm.
And they may know something about this, but the vast majority of GPs are not that aware. I have heard so many unfortunate stories about people and families going to their GP and their GP says, well, you have to accept this. There's nothing that we can do about it. So the types of physicians, the progressive physicians and practitioners out there that you need to see fall into a community that are referred to as either functional medicine practitioners and physicians.
Yep.
There's also another moniker, which is precision medicine or personalized medicine. And I actually describe those types of resources in the book. And of course, neurologists, you get to a neurologist to really have a good workup done, because diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, particularly when you're when you're starting to have symptoms, of memory loss or problems with just running your life, it may be a difficult diagnosis. Now, in the book, I talk about lots of risk assessments that can be done. Typically, in an office, they go to immediately a neuropsychological assessment, like what's called the mini mental exam. There's many others. And they may do other assessments along with that. Neuroimaging, which is very expensive and often is not done, can be another window. And what I talk about is the comprehensive approach to an assessment process like that, and using many assessment tools. So assessing for your genetic risk or your genetic profile, and looking at cardiovascular disease issues and diabetes and looking at inflammation, and if you're having trouble getting to a good physician that knows about all this and starting to do workups, looking at your risk and perhaps working with a neurologist also that is helping you and assessing all of these issues with you to really narrow down what is going on with you in your brain. Because in many cases, Rick, there have been well-documented cases where people are starting to have memory slippage, and it's through normal and not disease process oriented issues like nutrition, B12 deficiency, thyroid problems, hormones. All of that can contribute to cognitive decline as you age, and they're easily reversible. So those are things that need to be looked at in terms of what's called a differential diagnosis. And you got to get to somebody who really is going to take you in their hands, guide you, and do all of this for you and with you so that you are well taken care of in the process. Because we now know that the early stages of Alzheimer's disease can be reversed in certain cases.
Well, this is the thing I was going to mention, Ralph, is there's some good news in there potentially for those who are getting proactive about this. It's not all gloom and doom, but on the realistic side, on the side that you see relatives that are suffering these conditions, it can be quite sad and quite impactful. And we do as much as we can for our loved ones, and oftentimes it is often too late. Is there a point in time where it is becoming too late that you can't reverse any of these things, or is there always hope?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's a bit of an answer here, so I'll try to condense it. Now, I talked about the 20 to 30 year time window. Now, in the beginning stages of the disease process, which is called the preclinical stage, there are no symptoms, no observable signs. You're perfectly normal, seemingly.
Yep.
But the disease process is starting to brew. And that's why it's so important to look at your risk factors before they start brewing into a more noticeable sign of cognitive impairment. And indeed, from the preclinical stage, you can morph into the next stage, which is mild cognitive impairment. That is diagnosable. And in mild cognitive impairment, you do have either memory loss or problems with what's referred to as executive function, which is thinking and planning and running your life. It's like the CEO of a company. You have to run your life in your home and perhaps your family. And if you're having trouble with all of that, then you got to get to somebody as soon as possible so you can be evaluated. But in mild cognitive impairment, there are clinics and progressive physicians that are working with individuals like that. And there's one physician that has made a name for himself here in the United States. His name is Dr. Dale Bredesen. And he has documented a reversal of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's in those patients. So it is possible. And the research does say now that many cases of Alzheimer's disease is preventable. So you got to get to it earlier. Once you have a full-blown dementia and you are really having problems, there's probably not much you can do except to perhaps slow and stabilize.
Right.
So it's important to get at this as early as possible. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I'd love to, if we could, Ralph, and thank you so very much for sharing your insights. It is very powerful information that many of us are just simply not aware of, so thank you. I'd love to talk about the construct of the book and the timeline between conception, yes, I'm going to write this, to that moment in time where you actually release the book and the journey in between. Can we talk about that?
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey. As I said, I started this research in the late 90s. and I knew I had a book in me.
Mm-hmm.
But I just got very serious about the research, and around 2006, I came across some research around the hypothesis of type 3 diabetes, which I talk about in the book, and that is what's referred to as an brain insulin resistance model. So we know that type 2 diabetes is largely a insulin resistance disorder. And there's another related disorder that's called the metabolic syndrome. And those are two disease processes which are related, are marked by insulin resistance. And researchers in 2005 were looking at issues with neurological problems associated with Alzheimer's disease. They were looking very carefully at insulin in the brain because insulin is extremely important in the brain for learning and memory. So it has a different role in the brain than it does in the body. It does assist with some glucose uptake and metabolism in the brain, but its most important function is in memory and learning processes at the synapse, the connection between the neurons or the brain cells, right?
Yep.
So they were looking at this and they were seeing that insulin was dysfunctional in patients that had Alzheimer's disease. And the more they looked at that and did some research around that, they said, geez, this looks like an insulin resistance and very similar to type 2 diabetes. So we're going to refer to this here and after as type 3 diabetes. So that really captured my imagination. And I started to see a slew of research pop up after that. And I had already started a book project back then. And it was going to be a very comprehensive approach to the causes and risk factors associated with Alzheimer's disease. But I hired a book coach, and she turned out to be terrible. So I spent all my money with her and wound up with a failed project.
Nothing. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I was pretty disillusioned at the time, and so I pulled back and thought, what am I going to do now? So I just started writing articles, created my website, thealzheimerssolution.com, and continued on with my research. And the more and more I looked at this type 3 diabetes model, eventually a light went off and I said, this is my next book. So I thought, great, I'm going to call this the diabetic brain, and I started to put my information together. It was a very slow process because, I'm very meticulous in my research.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and so I just started to piecemeal a lot of pieces about type 3 diabetes together and a lot of associated issues connected to it. And started to write on that, wrote an article, got a lot of feedback immediately because this was really an emerging and very interesting topic on Alzheimer's disease. And I had full-time work at the time, and so I was barely able to scratch out, my writing time over the weekend. It was a very slow process, bottom line.
Yep.
But I finally got it together. And actually, I thought a couple of years ago this was going to be published. But I hired another book coach, and he said, oh, no, you're not quite ready yet.
Oh, whoa.
He said, you really got to make this into a print version. I was just going to put it up as an ebook. And he said, you got to really make this a print version. And that brought up a whole bunch of problems for me because I had created these illustrations that I really wanted people to benefit from as far as understanding more deeply the information I was writing about. And I didn't realize when I had hired designers for the illustrations that I designed that they didn't translate very well into a black and white book.
Oh, of course. Yes.
And so I had to go back and reconstruct so much of that. And it took a long time. It literally took me a couple of years to go through all the changes I had to go through. So water under the bridge,
yes.
But it was a painful process.
I can just imagine.
I just so desperately wanted to get my information out there.
Yeah.
And
the fact that it's out there, and I've seen some wonderful reviews that it's having already. How long
Yeah,
has it
thank you.
actually? How long has it actually been out at this stage?
Well, I had it online as a free version just to test the waters, and there was definitely some downloads. And I'm glad I didn't publish it at that time because it wasn't nearly the book that it is today. So those 2 years in many ways were a gift because it gave me an opportunity to strengthen much of the information and to enhance it. And so, and there's so much more I can do about that. Actually, I meant to create something that was perhaps 3 times as large as what it currently is.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, I'm writing 2 other books and have several others planned that will be a more comprehensive overview. The next one is on nutrition, which is called the Improved Mind Diet, and that'll be out the first of next year. So there's a lot more coming,
Mm-hmm.
and the book as is a wonderful explanation, however, on the main causative factors and the importance of taking control, earlier in life. So it's a very important read for people that have a family history, that have been assessed or have done their own a 23andMe test and have been shown to have the ApoE4 marker that they're a carrier of.
Yeah.
And there are other risk markers linked to Alzheimer's disease that
Mm-hmm.
I talk about in the book that are easily available. And, there are many people that are very, very passionate about prevention, and they're looking into all of this. So they're looking for this kind of information.
Absolutely.
And my book is a very strong science-based approach. It's
Yes.
suitable for physicians, and it really delivers on, what people need to know and understand more deeply about all of this to know what Alzheimer's disease is not only all about, but what they can do to hopefully prevent it for themselves.
I'm just thinking, if I open this book, is it something that I should read from cover to cover, Ralph, or is there a way to approach this book? Is it something you can go back to and take what's useful for you at the time? How best do you suggest people read this book?
Well, it depends on their background. If they're a physician, they can get through it very quickly because it's not that big of a book.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a lay person and you're not familiar, you're just kind of curious about this,
Mm-hmm.
it's good to go slow, maybe a chapter at a time. And especially the first couple of chapters. The first chapter is actually my story, and setting up the book in terms of why I wrote this and my personal interest in all of it. And then the introduction really explains, the setup for the rest of the book and the content. So my story and the introduction is a great way to get started. And then read the ensuing chapters. Chapter 2 is all about the startling statistics around the associations of type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease. So when you sink into chapter 2, you're going to get a very strong impression just how important all of that is for you and your brain as you age.
So I wonder, I look at business owners and I speak with a lot of entrepreneurs, and they seem to be, very busy in the mind. They seem to be, many of them at least, stressed, if you like to call it that.
Oh, yeah.
Is this something that is going to contribute to your potential? I know we've talked about predisposition and markers and things like that. Is this something that we should be mindful of, let alone the need to keep busy and have great nutrition? What about the mind in this respect?
Oh, you make a great point, Rick. Thank you for bringing that up. Nutrition and lifestyle is essential to everybody interested in the hopeful prevention of something like Alzheimer's disease. It's very, very important, obviously, for diabetes and cardiovascular disease too.
Mm-hmm.
But the nutrition and lifestyle and stress component that goes along with it, is critical. Stress kills brain cells. And stress is actually a very strong uh, comorbidity. It's linked to the issues related to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So controlling stress is really, really important. Stress ramps up what are called stress hormones, like cortisol. And cortisol contributes to the issues of heart disease and diabetes. So you talk about being mindful. Uh, Doing mindful meditation practices is very, very important, or something like yoga or other forms of meditation. These are all very important stress modification techniques. Exercise, extremely important as well, too. And the nutrition end of it is all about getting, and this is what I cover in the Improved Mind Diet, a bounty of protective, what are called phytochemicals, plant chemicals,
Mm-hmm.
that are anti-inflammatory and antioxidants. Because when you have these disease processes brewing and when stress is ramping up, you're creating a lot of inflammation. And another related phenomenon that's referred to as oxidative stress. And oxidative stress just described that you may not have enough antioxidants, enough of an antioxidant reserve in your body to combat, all the free radicals associated with inflammation. And that's a huge issue for your brain.
Mm.
So yes, lifestyle, stress modification, nutrition, you can't overemphasize the importance of all of that.
Yeah, thank you so much again for your feedback, and everybody's on the My Future Business live stream today. This has been a jam-packed, content-full session. Now, I wonder, I'm thinking about rewiring the neuro pathways, given that we've just talked about
Yeah.
stressors and things like that. Is that at all possible? And what do you think
Yeah.
about that sort of field?
Well, absolutely. I mentioned that a little bit in the book. And that revolves around a very important concept in brain health and keeping your brain younger as you age. And it's referred to as neurogenesis,
Neurogenesis.
generating new brain cells. And guess what are the most important things in helping that process along as you age in life? Nutrition,
And lifestyle.
lifestyle,
Yep.
stress modification.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things help you to promote new brain cells, having an active social life, and anything that you can do that really stimulates your brain, learning new things, keeping your brain stimulated, you know, uh, those are all extremely important things to focus on that promote the generation of new brain cells, neurogenesis. That's actually the topic of my third book.
Well, there you go. Well, there's some
Yeah,
wonderful insight to something that's coming up
yeah,
very soon. You talked
yeah.
about stimulants, Ralph. I'm wondering, when we live in an age where drugs and alcohol, coffee, all of these things are almost omnipresent in our society. What is your take on the consumption of prescription medications, alcohol, and prescription and things like that? Prescription drugs.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to just say a little mention about drugs because a very popular over-the-counter medication that's used for inflammation are referred to as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory
Mm-hmm.
um, drugs, NSAIDs. And they're very popular for arthritis and pain and inflammation, but there is a real downside to them.
Yep.
And, you can run into real trouble with your liver function and kidney function. And they do wonderful things for inflammation, but it's been well documented that a lot of powerful anti-inflammatories derive from things like curcumin, and green tea have just a powerful effect as NSAIDs do in controlling inflammation and reducing the pathways associated with pro-inflammatory cascades.
Mm-hmm.
So focusing on anti-inflammatory agents through nutrition is very, very important. So I recommend minimize NSAIDs and start to work with somebody who can help you to replace them, because there are wonderful replacements for whatever ails you in terms of pain and inflammation or other inflammation-associated disease issues. Now, the other part of your question, Rick, which was, stimulants, um, you have to be a little careful with caffeine. Caffeine is actually good for your brain. But too much for certain individuals that have a genetic issue with caffeine, they don't metabolize it very well.
Mm-hmm.
So if it makes you jittery and jumpy and too stimulated, then it's probably not the greatest idea for you. But in general, coffee is very good for the brain. So having a little coffee, as a matter of fact, there's been several studies shown that coffee drinkers at the rate of 3 to 4 cups a day have a lower risk for Alzheimer's disease.
That's good news.
Yeah, absolutely. But I really caution 3 or 4 cups can be way too many because of the caffeine. But similarly, you'll get less caffeine out of green tea. And green tea also has the same powerful effect as, the coffee does, because they both have very, very powerful antioxidants in them. And the green tea side of it has been well researched and publicized. So green tea is a wonderful beverage to consume regularly. And like coffee, lots of studies showing that green tea drinkers,
Yep.
and I talk about that in the Improved Mind Diet, green tea drinkers definitely have a lower risk for Alzheimer's disease. So coffee, green tea, a little caffeine, that's all fine. Wine and alcohol, red wine particularly, has been shown to be helpful. The Mind Diet studies, which I based my second book on, The Improved Mind Diet, is actually around the associations of the Mediterranean diet, which includes moderate wine drinking. And many studies have looked at that. And moderate, what's referred to as moderate, like a glass of wine on a daily basis, can actually be helpful in reducing the risk. So a little bit can be very good, particularly red wine, because of the antioxidants and anti-inflammatory components to it. But hard alcohol and too much even wine is not a good idea.
Yeah.
So be very careful about that.
I see this trend in Australia, in certain places in America, and certainly in Europe, where cannabis is becoming legalized and I guess more mainstream in society. What is your take on, I guess, cannabinoids and how they affect the brain, and whether or not they're a good or bad thing or other?
Well, they are indeed popular, aren't they?
Yes, they certainly
and they
are.
can and they can be helpful for improving cognitive function. They're known to stimulate certain receptors that are in a family of receptors, endocannabinoid receptors, and they can definitely improve mood and lift cognitive function in certain ways. So in some people, it can be helpful, and especially in terms of information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I caution people to just rush out and reach for one thing that's the magic pill or the silver bullet, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And constructing a protocol that's most appropriate for you, you really should work with somebody that knows how to evaluate and to recommend the appropriate things. That's personalized. So I talk about personalized medicine a lot in the book. And anything that's personalized to you is going to be much better than just going out and buying a slew of things that have a lot of hype associated with it. I have a program called Brain Defend. And in Brain Defend, I guide people very carefully through nutrition and lifestyle factors and supplementation that's most appropriate for them, guiding them through tests and what those tests reveal and how it all fits into a personalized approach for a healthy body and brain.
Yeah, look, I'm sure we could go deep and wide on all of the amazing insights and the experience and knowledge that you have. Where are people going to go to find your wonderful work?
Well, the book is up on Amazon. All you have to do is in the search, look at the diabetic brain,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll pull it right up. Today, Monday the 28th, is actually my Amazon promotion day. And so it's a great time to go over there and get the Kindle version for 99 cents.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And if you're not a Kindle user, there's a little app that you can download right there.
Yep.
But Amazon's a great place to go look at the book. If you want to get more familiar with me, there's a little profile there as well too. And then the Alzheimer's solution.com, where you can access a lot of videos and articles and more information about my program, Brain Defend. And I actually have a page dedicated to the diabetic brain book, and you can access that at thediabeticbrain.com, where you can read a little bit more about what the book is about before you dive in, if you care to do that.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, everybody who's on the live stream today, I hope you've taken some notes down, and I will be making the links back to Ralph and his wonderful work, and you can also find that on the My Future Business website. Ralph, thank you so very much for spending some time with me on the My Future Business show.
It was such a great pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity, Rick. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the call, then make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, share us with your friends, and book your spot on the show at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. And if you're looking for solutions that will help grow your business, then visit myfuturebusiness.com/shop.